Hey there, Eli coming at you again from the Coral Rooms of Coventry today with another episode of What is a Coral? This is a real treat for you guys. This happens to be one of my favorite corals. And yes, feel free to tease me about it. It is one of the ugliest corals you're ever going to come across, but it's special. These two brown lumps to the side of me here are what's known as Heliopora caerulea, or the blue ridge coral. This is something that's kind of become a little more uncommon in the hobby. For a while, this was on the endangered or threatened list, and collection of this coral stopped. So any of the stuff that you see in the hobby has been in the hobby for quite a while. And contrary to its appearance, it is actually truly a soft coral. Now, this coral is so special because it does put down a hard, stony skeleton beneath it. You may be wondering, how can a coral put down such a dense, stony skeleton and still be considered a soft coral? Now, when we first introduced this What is a Coral segment, we talked a little bit about some of the different polyp structure between soft and stony corals and how we can designate those two differences. One of the biggest being the polyp symmetry between a stony coral and a soft coral, with soft corals being known as octocorals, meaning that each of their polyps exhibits eightfold symmetry. So most of their polyps are going to have 8 tentacles, whereas if you look at a stony coral, or your typical stony coral, it will have polyps that are divisible in multiples of 6. So the polyp will either have 6, 12, 18, and so on, different tentacles on the end of it, but they will never be in sets of 8. Whereas these two pieces are closed up right now. We did get the chance to shoot some B-roll of one that does have polyps out right now. And on a close-up, you will be able to tell that each individual polyp has 8 distinct tentacles to prove that is the true octocoral. So commonly in the hobby, this is known as blue ridge coral. And why is that? So I have a small piece of skeleton here with me. And although the lights are probably going to skew this, we can take a look at it later under some white lights. This coral does actually put down a blue skeleton. The skeleton that it produces actually has a blue coloration to it. And it's quite stunning, dark indigo almost color. And this is due to the iron that this coral will deposit within its skeleton as it grows, and that gives it this really cool appearance. So for a while, pieces of this coral were being taken off the reefs and actually killed, bleached, allowed to dry out just for the ornamental sake of its skeleton because it is so pretty. Oftentimes it will get kind of a foliose appearance to it where it looks almost like leaves, and it'll grow a really dense cluster, which is really cool. These pieces behind me are more of like a branching structure. It does also encrust, but it does kind of exhibit a few different growth forms in the wild. And it's a really pretty coral, even though it does look brown when it's got its flesh intact. That blue skeleton underneath is really cool. And under certain circumstances, sometimes you'll get a blue hue that you can see through the polyp structure as well. As for care for this coral, it is definitely not a very difficult coral. It does appreciate a good amount of flow. It does appreciate a good amount of light. But it is pretty forgiving in terms of both parameters. It can go just about anywhere you desire in your tank, but I would say somewhere that's going to get a decent amount of flow so it can shed its skin just like any of your other soft corals can. And that detritus is not going to build up in between those folds and ridges is going to be most important. In the wild, it's kind of interesting about this coral. Since it is a soft coral, it does participate a little bit more in some of your chemical warfare, just like your toadstool corals would or finger leathers. And it is a well-known fact that in the wild where these Heliopora settle, they actually will produce a anti-settlement compound into the water, and they will at least attempt to clean off the rockwork surrounding them so that they have more room to grow by releasing those toxins that are harmful to the other surrounding corals. Otherwise though, it is going to behave kind of like most of your stony corals, especially your LPS and some of your easier SPS. It does appreciate stable parameters. It does use calcium and alkalinity in your water. So keeping those as stable as possible is going to be important. Again, it does like a good amount of flow, and it would appreciate a decent direct source of light, but it is really not too picky otherwise. Fragging for this coral is pretty easy as well. As I mentioned earlier, any piece that you see in the hobby has been in the hobby for a really long time now, and it's pretty simple just to cut with a pair of bone cutters, or if you have a nice large piece like this, to be able to run it through a bandsaw to produce smaller fragments. And you can frag this coral pretty small and still have really good success with it growing out in the long run. However, if you go a little too small, you tend to get pieces like this one here that really just encrust for a long time. Whereas if you were to start with some longer branches and some more chunky pieces, they generally tend to take up a better growth form as they grow out. So definitely worth keeping in mind if you have a piece that you would like to be able to cut. So Heliopora, or blue ridge coral, a really interesting, weird little coral. As much as it resembles a stony coral and as much as it puts down a massive stony skeleton beneath it, it is truly an actual soft coral. so it's going to share the characteristics between the both of them. Pretty hardy aquarium specimen, but threatened in the wild, so it's really cool to know that this coral is being propagated in the hobby, and any piece that you see out there has not been taken from the wild for quite some time now. So just unique in that fact as well. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of What is a Coral for one of my favorites, the Blue Ridge Coral. As much as it is pretty weird, I tend to like this one, and I hope you do as well, or at least find it kind of interesting. As always, thanks for watching. Let us know in the comment section below if you have questions, maybe suggestions for future videos, and keep on reefing.